So briefly, what have you said?
Yes.
What have you said briefly?
I said that Jehovah's Witnesses are generally sincere people. We didn't come here to condemn them, but we have the same affection toward them as Apostle Paul toward Jews of the first century, which were sincere and zealous, but misled in their understanding of true worship of God. And now we would like to hear what you have to say.
Yes. I think that's very important, is to recognize the sincere desire that most Jehovah's Witnesses have. They do want to serve God. They want to serve Christ. They want to help people. But they have a certain mentality that has been developed in them that leads them to think in certain patterns only. And they need to become free from that. And that's what we can do, is to help them to see the reality of the Scriptures. My father became associated with the Watchtower organization in the year 1913, and he was baptized in that year. My mother shortly after that. I was born in 1922, 85 years ago, and so from my childhood on, that was all that I knew, was Jehovah's Witnesses. But when I reached my teenage years, I stopped attending the meetings, and my parents didn't oblige me to go. But I reached a point where I realized that my life was very empty. It had no purpose to it. So one night I saw my parents getting dressed up, and I thought they might be going to the cinema. So I asked them where they were going, thinking I could go along to the cinema. They said, "No, we're going to the meeting. Do you want to come along?" And I said, "No." So my father talked to me very frankly, and he said, "Raymond, why do you think you're going to survive Armageddon? You're not doing anything." He says, "These people that go to that church in the corner do more than you. You don't even do what they're doing. Why do you think God is going to spare you at Armageddon?" This was a real shock to me. My father had never spoken to me in that way. And so I went into another room and closed the door and cried. I came back out and I said, "I'll go with you tonight." What I can say is, of that one meeting, it caused me to renew my interest in the Bible. So I continued my association, and in the year 1940, when I graduated from high school, I decided to enter the pioneer work, to spend my whole time in the service of the organization. So for 40 more years, my entire time was devoted to the organization and the work of the organization. I spent over 20 years in the Caribbean islands, particularly Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And I experienced different diseases, and I lived with the people. I traveled around and I lived in their homes, ate their food. And in the Dominican Republic, I faced many dangers. There was a dictatorship there, and people who didn't agree with the dictator were often just disappeared. So I never knew whether something was going to happen to me. So in my own case, I know that I was sincere, that I really wanted to do what was right. I wanted to serve God, and I was willing to undergo different persecutions and difficulties on behalf of the people. So I don't doubt my sincerity, and I believe that God recognized that. So as Shimon has said, we have to acknowledge that Jehovah's Witnesses are sincere, and as Paul said of the Jews, "I bear them witness, they have a zeal for God, but not with understanding." If we go back to the first century, we find that the idea of worship being something very formalized and very systematized, that is not to be found there. The term that is often rendered church in many translations is the Greek word ecclesia. But it doesn't refer to what people commonly speak of today when they talk about a church. It wasn't even a religious term. Ecclesia was not a religious term. It was a secular term. It appears in Acts, the 19th chapter, when it tells about Paul's experience where he showed the people that they should not put their trust in gods and goddesses. And in this town where he was, there were many silversmiths, and they made images to this goddess. And so they were afraid that what he was saying would cause their business to suffer ruin. And it tells that they met in assembly, and it uses this Greek word, ecclesia. So they didn't meet in a church, in a building, or something like that. They just met as a group. So when they met in the first century, they didn't have certain buildings that they went to. They met in homes. In fact, history shows that for the first 3 centuries, Christians met always in homes. There was an entire letter written called the Letter to the Hebrews, and it was directed to Jews who were becoming interested in Christianity. And it helped these Jewish people to change their thinking, and it was a tremendous transition that they had to make. They were used to their worship that was centralized on the temple. They had a priesthood who wore special garments to distinguish them. There were many rituals and different sacrifices with a sacred altar, and all this was now to change. And this change was so great that this entire letter is to prepare them for this and to help them to see how now everything centers in Christ Jesus. And in this letter, the writer shows that all the things that had existed in the nation of Israel, the priesthood, the law, the temple, the altar, all those things were just shadows of greater things to come, and they're all fulfilled in Christ Jesus, who is the high priest. For example, with regard to the altar, the letter says in Hebrews chapter 13, "Our altar is one from which the priests of the sacred tent have no right to eat. As you know, those animals whose blood is brought as a sin offering by the high priest into the sanctuary have their bodies burned outside the camp. And therefore Jesus also suffered outside the gate to consecrate the people by his own blood." And he says, "Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer up to God the sacrifice of praise, that is the tribute of lips, which acknowledge his name, and never forget to show kindness and to share with what you have with others, for such are the sacrifices which God approves." So there was no physical altar, and even the temple, this letter shows that the temple was figurative of something far greater, which relates to the heavens. So to adjust their thinking from all these physical objects that they were used to and see everything from a spiritual viewpoint was a tremendous change for them. There's a book called Paul's Idea of Community, the history of the church houses, and the Australian author, he's a scholar named Robert Banks. He makes the point, he says, when Christians gathered, it was not gathering to worship, because their worship was something they did every day and all day long. And the Apostle Paul says the same thing in Romans chapter 12. He says, "Let us offer our bodies as a living sacrifice to God." So this spiritual altar that we serve before, we give these spiritual sacrifices, and they involve our whole self, our heart, mind, everything that we are. So we need to keep that in mind always when we think about worship, and realize that it is not something we do a certain day of the week or certain times of the week or certain places, but it involves the whole life. It involves everything that we have, everything that we are is involved in our worship. And it's interesting that the disciple James makes a similar point in the 2nd chapter of his letter. And
I suppose here.
yes, in the 1st chapter, rather, and beginning with verse 26, it says, "A man may think he is religious, but if he does not have control over his tongue, he is deceiving himself. That man's religion is futile. The kind of religion which is without stain or fault in the sight of God our Father, is this, to go to the help of our orphans and widows in their distress, and keep oneself untarnished from the world. And the word religion there is the Greek word latreia, which in the New World Translation of Jehovah's Witnesses is rendered sacred service. And they are told, we were all told, that sacred service involved going from door to door, witnessing, or attending meetings, or serving at the branch office or something like this, but nothing else was considered sacred service, just those things. So we had this very narrow view of what it was to serve God. And if we come to a knowledge of the truth, we'll see that it embraces many things, and it's something that we can have in mind and carry out every day and all day long. Now, do we want to have questions at any time?
There is a question if there is some connection between Jehovah's Witnesses and Christadelphians, because a brother, he's a former witness, he left the organization and he started reading eschatological publications of Christadelphians, and he found some similar interpretations. Is there any connection?
Well, there are many different religions that have a similar background to Jehovah's Witnesses. When Charles Taze Russell started the Watchtower magazine, he had become interested in what is called the Second Advent movement. And there are many other religions that came from that movement back in the 1800s. The best known is the Seventh-day Adventists. But there are many other smaller and less known religions. One is the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith, and it came from the same source, the Second Advent movement, which was started by a man named William Miller. And he had said that the coming of Christ was due to take place in that time, and he fixed on certain dates, including the date 1874, and gave prophecies too about the fulfillment of the times of the Gentiles as applying in that period. So when you see similarity between the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses and some of these religions, often if you go back far enough, you'll find that they had a connection with that movement of the Second Adventists under William Miller. Okay.
How do the Watchtower organization reconciled two opposite concepts? They prophesied by the mouth of Rutherford that the end would come in the 40s. And formerly they thought that before the Armageddon, the princes would be resurrected. How that they could reconcile that opposite opinions?
I know that in the 1940s I attended a convention. When I came home and summer ended and I put away my summer clothes, I told myself I probably will never take these out again, because by the time next summer comes, I will probably be in a prison or the Armageddon will have come. So I really thought that it was that close. But it came and it went. And later on they advanced the date of 1975. But they say, well, this just shows that we're very sincere. We really want to see the end come. Most people aren't that sincere. They're apathetic. But we have such intense desire that that's the reason we have settled on these dates.